From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Another piece of news on Thursday was that the Biden administration has extended the public health emergency for COVID-19 for another 90 days, which pushes it into January. And Kim, what's going on here? Because I seem to recall only about 3 weeks ago, President Biden being on 60 Minutes and saying that the pandemic is over. So can you help me understand the juxtaposition here?
Kyle, I feel like the response to every single question we have on this, what's going on here, is elections. And that's what's going on here as well, too. Just to put this in perspective, by the way, we are now in our third year of this. And yes, the president himself said just last month in an interview, the pandemic is over. But here's the problem, is that when you have that emergency situation, you are allowed to do all kinds of things you can't in a normal environment. That includes, for instance, we changed all the rules to allow millions of more people that would normally qualify to join Medicaid. It's allowed us, for instance, to do forbearance on student loans. It has allowed the government to offer free testing and free vaccines and free treatment. And if you end all of this, then suddenly you are potentially cutting off maybe as many as 15 million people from public health services like Medicaid. It would be very dramatic. That was why the White House was appalled when the president made his comment, because he might have been speaking truth, but he was not speaking politics. And now, wait, it'll be really curious to see. HHS Secretary Javier Becerra has said that when the administration is going to do this, they're going to give a 60-day notice to states so that they can gear up. They wanted to do it in time. That would put it a couple of days after the election. I will be fascinated to see if a couple of days after the election, our emergency is finally over.
But it has been fascinating to watch, Alicia, the Biden administration seeming to pick and choose which agencies, which policies are still under pandemic emergency rules and which of them aren't. And one of them that's not, the Biden administration argued that the pandemic public health expulsions of people at the southern border could not continue because there was not any real pandemic need for it anymore. Student loans is another one. So the president says he's forgiving up to $20,000 per person in student loans, and that's to deal with harms that were caused during the pandemic. And yet we have a letter here from Mark. And he says President Biden based his one-time student loan forgiveness on the damage the pandemic has done to people with student loans. But during the pandemic, student loan payments were suspended and no interest was charged. Thus, nobody is worse off after the pandemic than they were before the pandemic with regards to paying off their loan. And I think that's a good point, Alicia. I mean, here's another place where whether we're still in a pandemic seems to depend on what exactly the Biden administration is trying to accomplish.
Right. So there are various pandemic powers. I think the one that you allude to on student loans, that's the president's national emergency declaration that he has under the 2003 HEROES Act that would allow him to make any federal student loan program, which would include discharging debt. To your point about that they're not worse off, well, actually, a New York Federal Reserve paper actually found that the student loans or borrowers were actually better off because of the pandemic pause and all the transfer payments. That their credit scores actually improved during the pandemic. So the evidence here shows that, borrowers are actually better off, and therefore that's going to be hard for the administration to square in its legal arguments, assuming that the federal court actually can hear this case, because it's been very tricky to find a plaintiff who has, standing, i.e. has suffered a legal, concrete, and particularized injury. Some states representing that have federal student loan servicers argue that they have been. And if a court agrees, I think the administration will lose automatically, not just on the merits. There will be a preliminary injunction because it's so obvious that the administration, doesn't have this right to forgive the loans. To your other point about the other pandemic emergency powers, the FDA has continued to use those for emergency use authorizations for children's vaccines and boosters. And there's a strong argument that maybe these actually should undergo a longer review. This is no longer an emergency, and that maybe these vaccine makers should actually have to provide more evidence for both the safety and efficacy than they have been to get these approved. Just for instance, for the bivalent booster shots that are being rolled out, There was absolutely no evidence in any kind of human clinical trials that they are effective, that they'll help. It was based purely on mouse models, and you couldn't get any other kind of drug approved based on that alone. Meantime, to your point about the contradictions here, my reporting shows the FDA has refused to even consider a drug that's been pioneered by a small biopharmaceutical company called Iger that has shown actually pretty tremendous results in a phase 3 randomized controlled trial. And one of the justifications that the FDA is giving is that, well, at this point in the pandemic, the standard of evidence needs to be higher, and therefore it needs to go through a 2-year trial. So these agencies in themselves are not consistent in when they argue, is there an emergency or isn't there? Sometimes they use it to justify, actions that they want to take, and in other cases, they argue just the opposite.
Let's take a couple more emails from listeners, and since it's polling season, here's one from Mike in Ohio, and he says he hears from pollsters. He says, why are polls trusted and discussed by the pundits? Why do people cooperate? What would happen if people either don't cooperate or if they deliberately try to skew the results? I think it is the height of chutzpah for a private organization to randomly call me and virtually demand 15 minutes of my time, so I'm dragooned into participating into a product that is very valuable to the pollsters. Is it my patriotic duty to answer truthfully, to try to skew the results in favor of positions I support, or is it my patriotic duty not to cooperate? And Kim, I wonder what you make of that one.
What's interesting to me about what the listener says at the beginning of that question is what would happen if people either don't cooperate or if they deliberately try to skew the results. And one of the issues that's really been under discussion, in particular in the recent couple of election cycles, is whether or not that isn't something that a lot of conservative voters in particular do. They were very frustrated with polls in the past that have been very off at times, and they tend to seem to always be off in the direction that favors Democrats. There's even been accusations that some more liberal polling outfits do these polls that really are almost deliberately skewed toward the left as a way of demoralizing conservative voters and trying to discourage them from coming out. I mean, none of that is provable, but there is some real evidence to suggest that conservative voters, moreover, don't use or respond to polling questions as much as everyone else. And this has been an argument, for instance, of some of the more conservative pollsters like Trafalgar arguing that you need to use different ways to kind of get at conservative voters to have a more accurate reading of where the electorate really stands. I mean, is it your patriotic duty to do this, to answer truthfully? I mean, I guess I probably make the argument that if you agree that you're going to get on with the pollster, sure, be honest. None of us should actively be lying to other people, but I don't know if it's your duty to take part in this at all. I mean, the goal of this overall is to give people an idea, but I always kind of wonder, what would it be like if we didn't have any polls at all? Would it really change the dynamics of races? Maybe, I'm not sure, but it's an interesting thing to contemplate.
It would be fascinating, and we may be getting toward there, at least with regard to telephone polls. And I would point to a piece in the New York Times about their polling. And the writer says, in the poll we have in the field right now, only 0.4% of dials have yielded a completed interview. If you were employed as one of our interviewers at a call center, you would have to dial numbers for 2 hours to get a single completed interview. And so if those numbers keep going in that direction, I suspect we will get more online polling, more text message polling, more experiments like that. But I think Kim is asking the right question here, that it would be fascinating to know what political coverage and horse race politics would be like if we had no idea who was up and down at any given moment, as we've gotten pretty used to over recent years and decades. One final set here about our podcast on deferred action for childhood arrivals, or the DACA policy. We have one letter who says, I don't understand why you guys ended your podcast on finding a solution to the DACA problem created by Obama. You want to reward the actions rather than focus on the bigger problem of no accountability for a popular president to perform like a dictator and simply break the law. And I'll pair that with another one that says, Congress should have legislated a roadmap to citizenship for Dreamers years ago. That it didn't do so is an ongoing national disgrace. That aside, my question, which I don't recall being addressed anywhere, is what is the country going to do with its next generation of DACA? And Alicia, I put those together for one reason, which is that I don't think, to the first letter writer's point, I don't think that this was Obama's DACA problem. The problem is pre-existing him. It's these thousands of people who have grown up here and they don't have legal status and they have no memory of the country that they came from. And to the second letter writer's point, I think it's a good one. If one of the problems with the DACA policy is that it legalizes people who are already here without dealing with the problem of, as he says, the next generation of these dreamers. And Alicia, we'll give you the last word.
I think you're right. Actually, Congress has been considering this issue for basically 2 decades. Dick Durbin in the early 2000s first introduced legislation that would provide some kind of legal status. And so Congress has been grappling with this issue. And the problem was the fringes on both sides, including, by the way, Barack Obama, who kind of inserted a poison pill into an immigration reform proposal. They don't want any kind of compromise. They want to continue to use the Dreamers as basically pawns, and the DACA program, they want to use it to beat up each other for political purposes because they both think that they politically benefit from using this issue. So unfortunately, I'm a little despondent and don't think that even if the court ends up striking it down, I'm not so sure that there is going to be a political compromise in the near term. I mean, I'd hope so, but our political system and the parties are extremely polarized on this immigration issue. And even though, as you point out, that the Dreamers, they were brought to the country through no fault of their own, it's not like what's happening now where you have intentional, purposeful, illegal immigration. I think both parties are going to continue to try to leverage them and use them for their own political gain.
Thank you, Alicia. Thank you, Kim. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button. Wall Street Journal members can also join Paul Gigot, Kimberly Strassel, and Karl Rove for a live opinion event, Can Republicans Retake Congress, on Monday, October 17th at 7 p.m. That will be in Dallas or streamed online. And for more information, go to wsjplus.com/opinionlive for tickets and more information. And as always, we'll be back here next week with another edition of Potomac Watch.